I am delighted to have the optimism side of this talk. Because Bob is, Bob's a little generous with himself, this suggestion that you should have any sense of hope whatsoever at the end of his comments. The fact of the matter is, he's just explained to you that these people have flooded $10 billion into our political process, more than in any country in the world, and that they have not even gotten started. The fact of the matter is, you see, it's not like you guys, you folks. When you screw up, you get fired. When they screw up, they go into their billionaire donors and say, well, the test run didn't go perfectly, but we think if you give us another 10 billion, we'll do it right. Bob and I were just flying in through Detroit. We picked up the Detroit Free Press today. They said next year's U.S. Senate race in Michigan will cost 50% more than the 2012 U.S. Senate race in Michigan. Do you understand what we're talking about here? 10 billion last year, 15 billion next year, 20 billion the year after that, 40 billion 2 years later. Whatever they have to spend, they will spend it because they are buying control of your lives. And the fact of the matter is, that's a tiny amount of money to have control of the most powerful country in the world. A tiny amount of money to have power stand down as regards them and to stand up as regards you. A tiny amount of money, and exactly the same kind of money they spent during the Gilded Age to control power. The fact of the matter is, the history of the American experiment is a history of wealth on the march, seeking to use its economic power to control the politics of the republic. A simple equation. It has never been any different. Tom Paine, in the last years of his life living in upstate New York, if you consider Westchester County upstate, Tom Paine spent the last years of his life writing Agrarian Justice. And everybody talks about common sense, and everybody talks about the crisis, but the most important book that Tom Paine wrote was Agrarian Justice. And the reason it was so very important was because he said, after we fought this revolution to throw off the king, after we, the people, took on the most powerful empire in the world and beat it, after we, the people of this tiny coastal region in the United States, defeated global imperialism and colonialism, are we simply going to reestablish the British model here under another name? Are we simply going to make America no different than that which we revolted against? And Paine's argument was, you cannot do that. If this revolution is to have any meaning whatsoever, it must not merely be a political revolution, but an economic revolution. And the people of this new nation must have a fair distribution of the wealth so that no one begins their life in poverty, and so that everyone has an equal stake in the governance of the land. That is an American legacy. But it was written 200 years ago because the fight was real then, and it is real now. Nothing ever changes. Every generation has to walk into the battle and make it stand. And so we come here not to tell you the facts. We're glad to do that. That's fun, telling stories and stuff like that. But we come here to tell you, this is the time you have to engage. It's your job. And I know everybody wants to believe that they live in the worst of all possible times. That never has it been as bad as it is now. Never has it been so overwhelming, so difficult to overcome. And I recognize the pleasure and the comfort of telling yourself that you have no ability to change that which is awful. Because really then, you don't even have to come out on Sunday night in Troy, New York to a relatively hot old church and sit around with a bunch of relatively honorable people and listen to folks talk. You could stay home. But here's the interesting thing. Those who say we can't do stuff are wrong. How wrong? Larry Summers is not the head of the Federal Reserve. Not because the Obama administration thought different. It's not because powerful people on Wall Street thought different. Larry Summers doesn't run the Federal Reserve because you, the people, said that's a terrible idea to put that man in charge of our economy once more. That's a win, ladies and gentlemen. And I can tell you about a bigger win. If power had its way, tonight we would be talking about our war in Syria. But the fact of the matter is, they tried to do a war in Syria like they had done in Iraq, like they had done in Afghanistan, like they had done in Iraq before. War after war after war, but something different happened this time. They rolled their war proposal out in August, and members of Congress weren't in Washington, D.C. in the midst of the money and media election complex. They were out in their home districts. And a funny thing happened. The American people said, we don't want another war. Everybody says it was Putin stepping in. No. The American people stepped in. Brothers and sisters, I don't think anybody's told you this. Thank you for stopping a war. But you won't get that from our media, will you? You will not get that from our media. Because do you know what our media said after the American people, in polling numbers that showed literally 65, 70% of Americans didn't want to have military intervention in Syria? Showed that 70, 80, 90% of Americans were opposed to boots on the ground in Syria. Literally a complete rejection of our approach over the last 20 years to Middle East issues. After this was revealed and after the war was actually stopped, it didn't happen. At creating an opening for something that nobody ever mentions, diplomacy, which, by the way, is actually working. You know, it's an amazing thing. I say, there's no way diplomacy can work. The UN is useless. It can't stop anything. We can't do anything. There's no way, no alternative to war, except that when we didn't go to war in Syria, now we appear to be on the verge of a disarmament treaty with Syria, and we're starting to talk to Iran about disarmament there. The fact of the matter is the opening is incredible, what happened. And yet, instead of the media, what remains of the media in the United States saying to you, wow, you people are really pretty cool, right? You know, this is amazing. You might even be more interesting than Eric Cantor or Paul Ryan, because you seem to actually learn over time as opposed to just do the same dumb thing again and again. We are interested in you, American people. No, the media's response was, the American people are war weary. You know, you saw it all over. They said, well, the American people are war weary, which is effectively saying, well, there's nothing Americans like more than a war. We love our wars. We're just tired this weekend. You know, if we could get a decent rest, maybe like go upstate New York for a couple days, relax a little, maybe go to a cottage and take a once we get our vim and vigor back, we're going to be ready for another war because we're just war weary. We're not anti-war. Well, the media was completely wrong. We weren't war weary. We were war wary. Take a letter out of there. Instead of W-E-A-R-Y, I hope I spelled it right, we're W-A-R-Y. We're wary. Because unlike our politicians in Washington, and unlike the pundits on TV, we actually learn over time. We see things happen, we take note of it, and then we evolve as human beings. It's no wonder that many Republicans in Congress don't believe in evolution. But the fact of the matter is we do evolve. And what happened is, over 20 years, we saw this country launch wars in different places around the world. We saw this country pour its human treasure, our sons and our daughters, into military endeavors that robbed other countries of their human treasure, their sons and their daughters, took our economic treasure to such an extent that we are now told that we can't pay for food stamps for poor people because we spent it all on the war, or we spent it all on the banks. We took all this treasure, right, and poured it into all these wars. And the American people looked at that, and they paid attention, and they came to the conclusion that it doesn't work. That somehow that just doesn't seem to do the job. And so we weren't war weary, oh, tired. Just give me some little energy, I'll be ready for the next war. We were war weary. We have figured out it's not a good idea, and so we say to our elected representatives, don't do it again. That is the best news story of the last 20 years, and yet our media did not tell it that way. No wonder people feel discouraged. No wonder they feel overwhelmed. The fact of the matter is, you are told on a regular basis not only that you are powerless, but that you are tired. But you are not powerless, and you are not tired. It's our media that is increasingly powerless and tired and dysfunctional. And I love this guy. Yay. Dad, I want you to be at every one of my events. So let's talk a little bit about media, because it's important to understand that everything we're talking about here is a media issue. This is vital to understand. And it's not very complicated. It doesn't take a lot of, big, detailed explanation. The best way to understand the situation with our media today is to go and rent Woody Allen's film, Annie Hall. In the film Annie Hall, Woody is standing in line, telling in line for a movie, telling a story to Annie about a couple of old Jewish ladies sitting at the automat in New York City. And every time I tell the story, the cops come. But it's just the truth. I'm not going to fold back. And so the two old ladies are sitting at the automat, and the one lady says, "This is the worst food I have ever tasted. It's awful. It's inedible. It's just, ugh." And the other lady looks and says, "Yeah, in such small portions." And that's the reality of our media today. It's awful. And we don't have any of it. And this is something we should know. You got to take this in, ladies and gentlemen of Troy and the greater Troy-Albany region. We have less media covering serious politics today than we have had in any time in your lives. And you think, well, that cannot be. I have the internets. By and large, the internet doesn't cover. What the internet does is take from whatever has been produced by paid, journalists, whatever, the handful that are left, and then recycles, reproduces. Sometimes people do journalism online, but studies show that for every 100 journalists that are laid off from newspapers and radio and television, you're getting 2, 3, 4 people hired for online operations. It is a massive culling out of the number of people who wake up every morning and go out and try and cover stories. How many? How many? Well, since 2009, the beginning of the Great Recession, Bob and I have charted, along with a wonderful website called Paper Cuts that actually analyzes this, more than 22,000 newspaper jobs have been lost in America. More than 22,000 newspaper jobs have been lost in America. Around that time, in 2009, you had roughly 65 to 70,000 newspaper journalists. So you do the math. Watch them go. Watch them disappear. Whole newspapers have closed. Seattle, Denver, Albuquerque, Tucson, Kansas City, Kansas. Ann Arbor, Michigan, a college town, no longer has a print daily newspaper. Newspapers dying across this country, even when they remain, culling out their reporting staff, no longer distributing in their cities. In Detroit, Michigan, you can't get the daily newspaper because the papers don't distribute in the city anymore. In New Orleans, which actually had a little bit of news over the last few years. In New Orleans, the daily newspaper comes out 3 days a week. In Cleveland, the daily newspaper now comes out 3 days a week. I'm sorry, I believe there is a truth in advertising argument to be made that when you come out 3 days a week, you are not, in fact, daily. And the gap that is opening up is an economic and cultural gap that leaves the poorest of the poor, the most disconnected folks, further and further behind. And it's not just newspapers. Since the Telecommunications Act of 1996, it is estimated that as many as 20,000 on-air radio personalities have lost their job. 20,000 positions gone. And you ask yourself, well, how do they fill all that time on the radio? All those local personalities, all those local news people. I bet you here in Albany and Troy, you used to have a lot more local news shows and a lot more local news people going out and covering things. How do we fill that space? Well, it's easy. Rush Limbaugh. And the fact of the matter is, Rush Limbaugh is very proud. He's on hundreds and hundreds, thousand stations across this country. And they filled the space where they used to have all these independent, diverse voices talking with one voice. That voice, by and large, very right-wing. There are some liberal talkers, Ed Schultz, Amy Goodman, other folks who bring real perspective, but the fact is they are a minority in an overwhelmingly right-wing world. Television, a massive culling out of television on-air personalities. Fewer and fewer people covering the news, more and more of a void. And why do they fill that void? Well, this is the important thing to understand. You folks still, tune in. I realize most of you are probably smart enough not to watch local news, but the fact, do you know there's actually a study in Salt Lake City a while back that showed that if you watch the local news, you know less than if you didn't watch it? And you think, how could that be? How could how could I possibly watch and learn less? Except for this. If you watch it and it tells you things are important that aren't important, you have a skewed perspective. You actually know less about what matters in your life than if you didn't watch it. Because you wake up in the morning and you say, well, are there poor people who are hungry? That's important. Are there, is the climate changing? That's important, right? And then you go on and you say, well, no, what's really important is who won American Idol. And you're like, hold it. I guess I was wrong. Poverty isn't as important as American Idol. And so they have this, but they still do these 22-minute newscasts. Most Americans get their news, by the way, from their local evening news on TV. That is still the dominant source of information for most Americans. You can tell yourself, well, I read the internets. But the fact is, by the nature of it, you're out on Sunday night in Troy, New York. Come on. You are not as average as you'd like to think. And so the fact of the matter is most Americans are getting their information because they're very, very busy. They watch the local evening news. They listen to the radio in their car. And what do they get? Well, I'm not going to ask you to watch it every night. That would be cruel and unusual. But tune it in tonight when you get home. Turn on that 11 o'clock news. Say, go watch it. Here's what you're going to get. I guarantee you, I promise you, this is what's going to happen. Not making this up. They're going to start and they say, the Congress is in crisis. We're going to have a shutdown of the government. Hurricanes are coming, blah, 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 whatever. But first, your local weather. And they will literally, no matter what's happening, they're going to turn to the weather person, and the weather person's going to say, it was warm today, and it will be warm tomorrow. I'll be back later with more on this. And then they go to an ad, right? And then after the ad is done, you get like quick snapshots, one-liners. There was crime here, there was crime there, there was crime everywhere. Actually, crime stats are down, but we're going to tell you about a lot, so you think there's more. And then when that's done, after they say, and we would love to tell you about the school board or the city council, but we've just spent so much time telling you about crime that there's no time for that. And now the weather. And then the weather guy comes back on, and the weather guy spends 7 minutes on average telling you about the weather out of 22. Now, I'm not good with math, but that's about a third. And so you're sitting there, and what does the weather person tell you? I'm not making it, you got to watch it to see this. The weather person goes, it was a warm and sunny day today in the tri-state area. In Troy, it was 73. But in Albany, it was 74. And then let's look over to Great Barrington, where it got up to 76. Tomorrow, it will be, well, let's look. Albany, it'll be 73. Troy will be looking at 74, but here's the big news, folks. It's looking like Great Barrington might only get up to 72. And you're like riveted by this incredible revelation. And then they give you the barometric pressure. I have been in journalism for 30 years. I have no idea what barometric pressin is, but I've heard it every night of my life. And then after they do the barometric pressure, then they get into the big stuff. They're like, well, out here just off the coast of Japan, there's a little weather system stirring up. And it's possible it'll come across the Pacific and hit the West Coast about a couple weeks from now. And then if it goes just this way and hits the Adirondacks, we might have rain sometime in November, and there's an outside chance it'll snow this winter. And no, I'm sorry, no, watch it. They're gonna go through all this stuff, and you're just blown away. You're like, wow, who would have thought snow in winter? What next? And the incredible thing about this huge infusion of weather is because weather is free. Weather is created by the government. I know, you say, oh, I heard that conspiracy theory and I've discounted it largely. No, weather is in fact created by the government. The National Weather Service goes and gathers all the information. They actually gather that it was 73 in Albany and 74 in Troy. And the fact is, the TV station doesn't have to pay anything for that. They don't have to send a reporter anywhere for that. They don't have to cover the school board. They don't have to cover the city council. They don't have to cover state government. They don't have to cover poverty. They don't have to cover our disenfranchised neighborhoods. They don't have to do anything. They just tell you what you already knew. It was a warm day. And that's what passes for news in America. And we should be absolutely aghast because it is so fundamentally useless to us. It is so damaging to our citizenry that at the end of the day, we do come out knowing less than if we hadn't watched in the first place. And worst of all, we studied this around the country. There are places in so-called battleground states. You're not one in New York. You're relatively liberal and democratic. You're pretty predictable in your voting patterns. But there are actually places where elections are competitive. And not for Congress because they gerrymandered all the districts, but for the Senate and president and things like that. And they pour this money into those places. Do you know what they're doing in some battleground states? This is an incredible thing. They've actually expanded their local newscasts. And you're like, wow, finally the people are going to get some information about their government and politics. No. They expand the local newscast so there's more time to sell ads around the news. And then, not making this up, after they expand the local newscast, they cut down the number of minutes of news. And so like and they'll go like, Sky Weather Watch Wild #7, expanded newscast. And you're like, wow, great, I'm getting more news. No, you're getting more ads. It literally, they expand the period of time so they can fit more ads in and make more money. Because politicians want to buy ads around the news because people who want to have information go to watch the news. But the problem is they don't get information from the news. And so, in this incredible void that is opening up, 22,000 reporters lost, 22,000 newspaper employees, not just reporters, editors, other staff, lost since 2009. Newspapers closing across the country, radio stations shutting thousands of on-air personalities, television stations doing less and less news coverage. The void opens and opens and opens, and it is filled with all the ads that Bob talked to you about. And so we end up in this horrific situation. It is the nightmare scenario where you literally have been denied meaningful and useful information and given lies, propaganda. Norway does not allow political ads on television because they said, why would we allow candidates to tell you their spin, their lies, their propaganda before an election? People need real information. They don't need a bunch of negative ads. And so we end up in sort of a billionaire's dream scenario. No news, free range, open space for ads, and I'm the optimist. Let me tell you why. We know the crisis is real. It's getting more real by the minute. There are places across this country where political races for important offices aren't even covered anymore. In 2010, we chronicle in the book, in the state of Illinois, the #2 office, lieutenant governor, there was a Democratic primary for lieutenant governor. Multiple candidates got in, many of them highly qualified, African-American legislators, women state legislators. They were all beaten in the Democratic primary by a pawnbroker who spent $2 million. He had money, they didn't. He won the primary. No major publication in the state of Illinois gave serious coverage to the lieutenant governor's race. It was only after the pawnbroker was nominated that it was revealed that there are major accusations of spousal abuse, drug abuse, and all sorts of other crises in his life. He had never held public office. He bought the nomination. No one had covered the process until after he was nominated. It created a political crisis in Illinois. And the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times both wrote columns, and they said, you know, maybe we should have covered that race. Yeah, maybe you should have. Same thing in South Carolina, where a candidate was nominated for the U.S. Senate, and after he was nominated, incredible revelations about what a bizarre character, all sorts of complex things in his life. Again, and everybody's like, well, maybe we should have covered that race. Well, you know what? Maybe you should cover a lot of races, and maybe you're not doing it. And so we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to fill this void? What are we going to do? And we can't lie and say that somehow the market's going to fix it. The fact of the matter is, in countries around the world where they have dramatically higher turnout in elections, where they have dramatically more engaged politics, and frankly, they have a more reflective politics, their media is funded by the people, by their tax dollars, by fees on their televisions. And the truth of the matter is, the freest countries in the world, not by our measure, by the Economist magazine's Democracy Index, by Freedom House's index, the freest countries in the world have the most highly subsidized media. And you do it not to have government control of media, because that's the first thing they'll yell, oh, the government's going to control your media. No, no. You create a structural system with real barriers and real walls that say that the money is collected, perhaps through a fee on television, or perhaps directed by the citizens themselves. Dean Baker suggests a plan where every American citizen is given a $100 democracy credit. It's part of your, you get a $100 democracy credit, you take it off your taxes, but you can give that money to any independent, not-for-profit media you want to support. And you say to yourself, well, that could never work. The fact of the matter is, in countries around the world, similar systems work. In Slovenia, they spend 75 times per person what we do in the United States on maintaining independent, non-commercial media. In Norway, it's roughly 40 times what we do. In Germany, it's roughly 20 times what we do. In England, it's roughly 50 times what we do. It's overwhelming what other countries do. And there's something else that's overwhelming in those other countries. Dramatically higher election turnout. Just last week, Germany had an election. 72% of the voters turned out. It was considered to be the dullest election in German history. No, it was an incredibly boring election. It was an interruption before Oktoberfest. And everybody's like, they knew Angela Merkel was going to win, they knew it was dull, and yet 72% turned out. Do you realize how different America would be if 72% of Americans voted? Everything would be different. Everything would be different. We would not be talking about Obamacare. We would be enjoying single-payer Medicare for all, health care covering every citizen of this country. Period. It wouldn't be a debatable point. We wouldn't be talking about bailing out banks. We would be talking about bailing out the victims of banks who are underwater with their mortgages. We would be saving neighborhoods, not allowing them to be destroyed. And we wouldn't be talking about taking away the rights of union workers. We would be talking about expanding the rights of all workers so that no one who works a 40-hour week in this country lives in poverty. That's how different we would be if 72% of Americans turned out and voted. Simple reality. Our political system and our media system creates a depressed and dysfunctional democracy. Our political system and our media system creates a depressed and dysfunctional democracy. 52% of voting age Americans voted in 2012. 52% of voting age Americans voted in 2012. 20 points behind Germany in the dullest election in their history. Almost 30 points behind Norway. I mean, we literally push huge portions of our populace out of the politics. And we talk about voter suppression. It's true. There are voter ID laws. There's all this. The number one voter suppression in America is the money and media election complex. It drives more people out of politics than any voter ID law. It makes our politics so dysfunctional, such a turnoff, so hard to tune into that people tune out. So we got to change it. We do have to create a radically different media. But we also have to do a lot more. And I'll close off with just a simple concept here, and perhaps the most important one we'll deliver to you. Bob joked about the fact that we turned down Carnegie Hall. It was actually Shea Stadium. But no, the bottom line is, people ask us, why do you go to places like Baltimore and Troy and small towns in Iowa and Wisconsin and places? Why don't you just go where authors usually go on author tours? And we have a very simple answer to that. Nothing good ever came out of Washington, D.C., right? Everything good that ever happened in this country started in a place like Troy, New York. It's a simple reality. And we desperately wanted to come to Troy, New York. We desperately wanted to come to upstate New York because everything good that ever happened in this country started in upstate New York. No, I'm not kidding. No, I'm not trying to make you feel good. Where did John Brown come from? Upstate New York. Where did Harriet Tubman settle after she got free? Upstate New York. Where was Seneca Falls? Upstate New York. The feminists started the whole damn thing here in upstate New York. And if you count Westchester County, where did Tom Paine live? Upstate New York. It all started here. You guys always fix the damn thing. And so we had to come to you and give you some tips on how we can fix it this time. And the way we fix it this time is to believe that Tom Paine was absolutely right when he said we have it in our power to begin the world over again. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. What he meant by that, and Paine had this other great line, fabulous line. He said, because only the living will experience the actions of government, only the living should have a say in how their government is organized. We are the living. And the fact of the matter is we currently have a constitution that is dysfunctional for modern democracy. And so it is time to amend the Constitution of the United States to say that money is not speech, corporations are not people, and we, citizens, have a right to organize a democracy in which fair and free elections can take place, and no one can buy our politics or our government. We, the people, have a right to say that it is absurd for our Supreme Court to make it easier for money to flow into politics and harder for people to vote. And so we have a right and a responsibility to advocate for a constitutional amendment that says every citizen has a right to vote and a right to have that vote counted, never, ever to be trampled on by Congress or the courts. Every citizen has a right to vote. We should be talking about a constitutional amendment to end gerrymandering so that people don't have uncompetitive congressional elections. And we should be talking about a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College because George Bush wasn't elected in 2000. He lost by 540,000 votes, and he only came into the presidency because of a fantasy of governance created in 1787. The Electoral College should be eliminated in this country so that we have real elections and real democracy. And I know you're all, now I know, whoa, I know what you're saying. You're saying, oh, Mr. Nichols, I love hearing this talk in Troy on a warm Sunday night. It's fabulous. It's great, but I fear that I'm going to walk out that front door and I'll be walking down the street in this beautiful neighborhood past that Freedom Square. And I fear that at some point I might have doubts in my head. I might start to think Mr. Nichols wasn't right. It might be a little hard to amend the Constitution. It might be a little hard to fix this country. It might be a little hard to get the media that we should. And maybe we just can't do it because it's impossible. Well, Bob and I say in this book, and we argue everywhere, that you should never do anything that isn't impossible. Never. If somebody tells you, oh, that's easy, that's possible, don't bother with it. There's a politician that will do that, right? Your job as citizens is to do the impossible and to believe it is possible. That's why I come to upstate New York, because you know what? Harriet Tubman, she believed it was possible to end slavery in this country, and we did. You know, the women at Seneca Falls, they believed it was possible to get the vote, and we got it. You know, Tom Paine believed it was possible to revolt against the British Empire. We did it. The fact of the matter is, the impossible we do. It's how we get things right in this country. It's how we get things right. And 100 years ago, if you looked out across this wonderful country, this great experiment, and this country is a great experiment. Barbara Dean, Graham Dean, my friends from Great Barrington, come in, they do these wonderful songs. They're about the history of the American experiment, and they're never at a loss for songs of people doing great things, for songs of beautiful, revolutionary, radical progress made in this country, because we've done it throughout our history. The fact of the matter is, it's always happened, but we're not told about it. We don't think about it as such. 100 years ago in this country, if you looked out across America, here's what you saw. You saw a country where little girls worked as bobbin girls in mills, 6-, 7-year-old girls. They would run up and down amidst the whirling machines in the textile mills, reaching into the machines to change the bobbins. They didn't want to turn the machines off. They wanted to have the girls get in there quickly and move it. They had these jobs because their fingers were tiny. They were so small that they could get into the equipment there. But sometimes it didn't work well because they were so little, 6, 7, 8 years old, and their fingers would be cut off. Sometimes they would lose their hands. But it was okay, they were expendable. They were just little girls. They weren't real workers. They didn't go to school, I know. They didn't really get paid much, but they were in that factory losing their futures. And if a girl made it through, as a bobbin girl and grew up to be 16, 17, 18 years old, maybe she'd go to work in a textile mill. And in that textile mill, maybe on the 10th or 11th floor of a tall building in the downtown of a city like New York, she would work 8, 10, 12, 14 hours, and then when the room where they were working, making those shirts, when it caught on fire, they would run to the door to run down those stairs. Italian girls, Irish girls, Jewish girls, girls from all over the world, African-American girls who'd come north from the segregated South to break free. They ran to those doors. They're ready to run down those 11 stories of that building. They're going to make it, but the doors were locked to make sure that no one took a bathroom break during their 12, 14, 16-hour day. So those girls who had survived in the mills jumped out those windows to their death, one girl after another, until the streets of New York City were filled with dead bodies. That was America 100 years ago, not Bangladesh. That was America. And those women, those girls and women who worked in those mills and in those factories, they could not vote to make anything better because women were denied the franchise. And if they'd had the power to vote, they couldn't have elected their U.S. senators because we had an appointed U.S. Senate, not an elected U.S. Senate. We denied citizens the right to shape their own Congress. And if we had an elected Congress, a truly elected Congress, the government did not have the power to tax corporations and the wealthy because we had no structural tax system in this country that functioned. 100 years ago in America, 1910. By 1920, women had the right to vote. Our Senate was elected. We had created a tax system that allowed for progressive taxation. We did each of those things with a constitutional amendment. In a 10-year period, we passed 3 fundamentally changing constitutional amendments. They set the groundwork for the New Deal. By the end of that period, we had started to pass child labor laws, protections for women in the workplace. We were fundamentally changing the shape and nature of this country. And we did it all with constitutional amendments in a 10-year period. And you ask, well, how did that happen? They must have been supermen and superwomen. They must have been the most amazing people in the world. No, they were your great-grandparents. They were you. Except the one thing, they worked a little harder than you did. They usually worked 14, 15-hour days. They were immigrants who often didn't have access to education or a lot of the information that people have today. They did it from their heart. They would work those 12, 14-hour days, and then they'd go to a meeting of suffragettes. They would go to a meeting of trade unionists. They went and fought and shaped a reform movement in this country that fundamentally changed the United States. And Bob and I ask for nothing less today. The simple reality is, you either give up on this experiment, you say that you are not the equivalent of your grandparents and your great-grandparents, or you say, no, I get it. I understand what Paine said. It is for the living, not the dead. We're not locked in the rules and structures of the past. We are free to shape our destiny. 40 years ago, this year, Victor Jara The Chilean singer died in a stadium in Chile, killed by the Pinochet coup. Victor Jaras had a wonderful song. He said, "Take hold of your destiny. The future begins today." There is no future until you decide to shape it, brothers and sisters. 100 years ago, Americans decided to shape a future where girls didn't have to work in mills and women who worked in textile factories didn't have to jump to their death. They decided to shape a country that was worthy of the promise of the American experiment. It's time to do it again, brothers and sisters. It's time to get as serious about it as we've ever been. We need to change our media. We need to change our politics. We need to change our governance. We need to make this country everything it can and should be. And we need to do so not for ourselves, but because we are a part of a long journey. And we're only midway through. But nobody's going to get to that higher ground. Nobody's going to get to that city on the hill unless we do our job right now. Let's amend the Constitution. Let's fix our media. Let's make this the country that says we have it in our power to begin the world over again, and we're beginning now. Thank you very much.
Okay, John Nichols and Bob McChesney. Thank you. In recognition of the relatively late hour on a Sunday night, what they would like to do is just go directly to an informal question and answer and book signing. So we'll forego the usual formal Q&A. Anybody wants to stay and talk to them, feel free. And
I'm going to do one quick thing. We're going to let Barbara Dean ask one question. Because what was your question? I saw that deep look of disappointment. There we go. No problem. Because it's hot, and I know it's overwhelming, but we'll do this quick. Barbara?
Well, I changed my question during the course of your talk, but in thinking about how to actually organize so that we can change things and do the things you said. You know, we had the Occupy movement. It had so much hope in it. It had so much potential. It had all the right things, and it was destroyed for various, well, for all intents and purposes.
It was undermined in many, many ways. Yeah.
What would you suggest as a new organization?
You want to take a quick shot? And I'll take a quick shot. Promise we're going to get you out before it gets too hot.
Well, I think we should have historical perspective. Look at the Occupy movement as sort of a sign of things to come, not a sign of things that have passed. You know, we can't predict the future, and that's something that's very maddening for all of us. We have no idea what's going to happen in the future, and even the smartest people can't predict it. All we can do is look at the tensions present today, see what's going on, and try to be prepared for what might happen in the future so we can make whatever happen positive. And I think the tensions we see that led to Occupy have only gotten worse. It's not like, oh, well, now inequality's gone away, corruption's gone away, everything's great, there's no poverty. Obviously, matters are getting worse, stagnation's continuing. It's not going away, it's coming back. The same reason people occupied, the same reason 150,000 people came out to Madison to protest 2 years ago, those reasons are still there. So we're in a momentary lull. We have to think beyond just, you push a button, you get instant social change. And I think we have to come back now. There are lessons to learn from Occupy, from the Madison Uprising, obviously. Tactical, strategic questions. But they're solvable. That's what we should be talking about. But we're going to have a resurgence. We're not going to have a situation like we have now in America where 50% of our population is either low income or in poverty, much higher than it was a generation ago. That's just not an acceptable scenario. That's got to change. And it's going to change. Our job is to make sure it's positive change. It's humane. It leads to democratic outcomes. I think we can do it. I mean, I think that we have this discussion specifically as regard to Occupy. I mean, it was a movement that really was sort of took off, and it really didn't have a coherence. It was organized to really go very far. It did what it was set out to do, I think. It was like a flaming star. But it didn't really have much beyond that. But it was a way to announce to the world, look, we're here. The bottom 99% of this country are the sleeping giant. It is ultimately our country, and we're watching you guys now. And we got their attention. I mean, what do you think that there's such an effort to suppress the vote down in this country? Well, it's something that would have been considered literally obscene 5 years ago for the U.S. Congress to do is now, several states now are basically reinstituting Jim Crow type practices to limit the vote. Well, they know darn well they can't win a fair election, and that's the most important thing I'd say. Keep this in mind. We have the numbers on our side. They know they only win by buying elections, suppressing the vote, keeping the voting turnout down, warping the system. If we had anything remotely close to open, fair, democratic system, we'd win, hands down.
Bob McChesney. Let me just quickly say, I don't actually think Occupy is over. What I think is that we have, Occupy was part of a very long tradition in this country. Ebbs and flows of protest. People will go to the square, it will get cold, maybe they will go home, they will come back, and they always do. That's a given. And what I think that we ought to do is take a good look at the markers of our time. We stand up here in front of you and we tell you the media is horrible. The media is absolutely dysfunctional. And then we start to accept the media's narrative as what's going on. Well, damn us, shame on us, because the fact of the matter is the media doesn't tell us about the incredible revolt that is taking place right now in America. How many of you would have expected 5 years ago that we would have mass fast food worker protests across this country where people are showing up outside the fast food restaurants? Workers are literally walking off the job. There's a woman at a Family Dollar store in Madison, Wisconsin, when she saw the workers in front of Burger King, one woman working in a whole store, she called her boss and she said, "You better send somebody else to work here because low-wage workers are walking out." And she walked out the front door and locked the door behind her. The fact of the matter is, real things are happening across this country. And the thing they won't tell you is 16 states have already passed formal demands on Congress to overturn the Citizens United ruling and get money out of politics. 16 states, that's more than we've had for anything in a long, long time. More than 500 communities across this country have said we need to amend the Constitution to get big money out of politics. This is an unprecedented uprising. People need to understand that it's happening out there. And the gap in our country is not the citizenry. It's not the passion of the people. The gap in our country is a media that doesn't tell people that they're actually making the changes that are necessary. It's a gap that says, oh, the only thing that happens that ever matters is whether Eric Cantor decides to shut down the government this week or not. Well, who cares? I mean, I care about shutting down the government. It's incredibly damaging. It's a horrible thing. But that's a false debate created by the people in Washington. The fact of the matter is, out across this country, real people are trying to change the politics right now, and they're doing a great job. It's just an untold story that has to be told. And you know what gives me the most confidence of all? Biggest hope of all, I'll tell you right now. It's you folks. It's right here, right now, in this room. Bob and I said it. We're talking about flying in here, and we're saying, we always guess how many people are going to show up, And of course, Bob once went, I swear, I'm not making this up, he drove 4 hours to give a lecture. There was one guy there. One guy there. And the guy said, and Bob said, well, let's just sit down and talk. And the guy said, no, I'd prefer the lecture. Sometimes they don't show up, right? But the fact of and it turned out the guy was actually from Madison and had driven down. So they could have just done it at a coffee shop in Madison. But the truth of the matter is, we don't go anywhere in this country now where we don't see a crowd anymore. You people are doing it. You're coming out. You're coming out at this wonderful, wonderful sanctuary here in Troy, New York. You're coming out in places all over this country. It's happening. It really is happening. But the fact of the matter is, we've got to weave it together now. We've got to take it seriously. We have to have shared demands, not disparate demands. That was why the progressive movement worked so well. The progressive movement had the socialists, the progressives, the populists, they came together with shared demands. And when they got one thing, they didn't say, oh, we're done, let's go home. They said, okay, what's your demand? And they kept bringing more in, demanding more until they actually started to fix things. Well, that's what we have to do too. And you know what? When I look at every chair filled in here and I look at all your faces and I know that you've stayed through this warm evening so long and I know you'll come over and chat with us some more and ask a million other good questions, I have absolutely no qualms in saying, we're going to get it right. We're going to take our country back. And when we take our country back, we're going to make it dramatically better than it has ever been before. Thank you very much. Come on over and talk to us.